March 1591, the Sahara Desert. 4,000 Moroccan soldiers stood at the edge of the greatest empire Africa had ever known. They carried something the African warriors had never seen before: muskets, cannons, gunpowder weapons that could tear through flesh and bone from 100 yards away. Across the battlefield, 80,000 Songhai warriors prepared to defend their homeland. 10,000 cavalry in iron armor, archers, spearmen, an army 8 times larger than the invaders. The Songhai commanders were confident. They had a plan. They would stampede 1,000 cattle directly into the Moroccan lines, crush them in chaos, then charge with their cavalry and finish the job. The battle lasted less than an hour. When the Moroccan cannons fired, the cattle panicked and stampeded backward, trampling the Songhai soldiers. When the cavalry charged, musket fire ripped through their armor like paper. The royal guard knelt in formation and fought to the last man. By sunset, the wealthiest empire in the world had fallen. But here's what they never taught you. This wasn't just a military defeat. This was the systematic destruction of black wealth, black knowledge, and black power. And for over 400 years, they buried this story so deep that most black Americans don't even know their ancestors once controlled the gold that ran the world. After this video, you'll understand why the wealth gap exists. You'll know why your family struggles while others thrive. You'll learn the truth about an empire so rich that one king caused economic collapse across 3 continents just by giving away too much gold. And you'll see how the destruction of this empire in 1591 connects directly to your bank account, your neighborhood, and your children's future in 2025. This isn't ancient history. This is your stolen inheritance. This is the empire of Gao. This is Songhai. And this is the truth they tried to erase forever. Let me take you back further. Long before Morocco invaded. Long before the gunpowder and the blood. Let me show you what they built. What your ancestors created in one of the harshest places on Earth. The year is 1000 AD. The Sahara Desert covers 9 million square kilometers of scorching sand-burning rock and absolutely nothing. Daytime temperatures reach 50 degrees Celsius. That's over 120 Fahrenheit. Hot enough to cook an egg on a stone. Hot enough to kill you in hours without water. The desert has winds called Saimum, poison winds. They blow at temperatures of 54 degrees Celsius, 130 Fahrenheit, transferring heat to your body faster than you can sweat it away. Your organs shut down. You die standing up. This is where they built an empire. 4 groups of people came together on the banks of the Niger River. The Sorko people knew how to build boats from African mahogany and navigate the treacherous waters. The Gao people were hunters who could bring down hippos and crocodiles with nothing but spears. The Do people understood farming, how to make the floodplains produce rice and millet and couscous even in the dry season. And the Songhai people came from the north on horses, bringing mobility and military power. Alone, each group survived. Together, they built something the world had never seen. They called their capital city Gao. It sat right where the Sahara Desert met the green fertility of the Niger River. The perfect location. Caravans coming south across the desert with salt and Mediterranean goods. River traffic coming from the interior with gold and ivory and spices. Everything flowed through Gao. Everything. By the year 1000, Gao was already wealthy, but they were still small, still just one city among many in West Africa. The real power at that time belonged to the Empire of Ghana. Ghana had controlled the West African gold trade for over 200 years. They sat on top of the world's largest gold deposits. Not one giant mine like Europeans imagined. Thousands of small mines and panning stations scattered across the river valleys. During the dry season, when farming was impossible, Regular people would go out with their pans and sift gold dust from the riverbanks. They'd collect it in tiny amounts. A few flecks here, a small nugget there. Then the caravans would come through, and traders would lay out their goods. Salt, which was incredibly rare in sub-Saharan Africa. Cloth, tools, weapons. The locals would place their gold beside the items they wanted. The traders would take the gold if they agreed to the price. They called this silent barter because the different groups spoke different languages, and this system worked without words. Those tiny amounts of gold from thousands of individual panners added up. The 10th century Iranian geographer Ibn al-Faqih wrote that in Africa, gold grows in the sand like carrots and is picked at sunrise. He didn't understand the process, but he understood the result. An endless river of gold flowing north across the Sahara. And Ghana taxed every ounce of it. For 200 years, Ghana grew richer and richer. Their kings wore gold. Their buildings gleamed with gold. European and Arab traders arrived at their borders, with their mouths hanging open, unable to believe the wealth they saw. But empires don't last forever. Ghana made the same mistake every empire makes. They grew too large. They conquered too many neighbors. Their military spread too thin. Their administrators became corrupt. Their subject peoples demanded independence. And around the year 1230, a new power rose up from one of Ghana's conquered territories, the Empire of Mali. Mali absorbed Ghana, took over their gold mines, took over their trade routes, and became even wealthier than Ghana had ever been. The most famous king of Mali was named Mansa Musa. He ruled from 1312 to 1337, and he was the wealthiest human being who has ever lived. Not the wealthiest black man, not the wealthiest king, the wealthiest person in all of human history. Period. In 1324, Mansa Musa decided to make the pilgrimage to Mecca as required by his Muslim faith. But he didn't travel light. He brought 60,000 men with him, 12,000 slaves, all wearing silk and brocade, all carrying staffs made of solid gold. He brought 80 camels, each one carrying 300 pounds of gold. At today's gold prices, that's $500 million, $500 million in gold, just for a religious trip. And here's what happened. Every city Mansa Musa passed through, he gave away gold to the poor. He just handed it out. Fistfuls of gold, bags of gold. So much gold that he crashed the economies of Cairo, Medina, and Mecca. He destroyed the value of gold for the next 10 years, caused massive inflation, devastated their markets. One man gave away so much gold that he single-handedly controlled the price of the world's most precious metal. Think about that. Your ancestors were so wealthy that one king's generosity caused economic chaos across 3 continents. Jeff Bezos couldn't do that. Elon Musk couldn't do that. Bill Gates couldn't do that. All of them combined couldn't do what Mansa Musa did. And nobody taught you this in school. Nobody told you that your ancestors controlled the global economy for 500 years. They told you that Africa had no civilization, no history, no wealth. They lied. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because Mali, just like Ghana, before it eventually weakened. Around the year 1375, one of Mali's subject cities declared independence. That city was Gao, and Gao was about to build the largest empire Africa had ever seen. The man who started it all was named Sunni Ali. He took the throne in 1464, and he was nothing like the kings who came before him. Sunni Ali couldn't read or write. He rejected the Muslim scholars and their books. He believed in the old ways, the ancestral spirits, the magic of the African wilderness. The griots, the traditional storytellers, called him Ali the Great. The Muslim scholars called him Ali the Tyrant, Ali the Cursed. They hated him because he hated them, and he had his reasons. You see, the city of Timbuktu, just 200 miles from Gao, had become the intellectual capital of West Africa. It had 300,000 manuscripts, books on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, philosophy, poetry. Scholars came from Baghdad, from Cairo, from Cordoba in Spain to study there. Timbuktu was the Harvard and Oxford and Cambridge of Africa, all rolled into one. But those scholars had political power. They influenced kings, they made alliances, they plotted. And Sunni Ali didn't trust them. In 1468, Sunni Ali marched his army to Timbuktu. He sent a messenger ahead, who stood in the central square, drew his sword, and announced that anyone still in the city by nightfall would be beheaded. 100,000 people fled in panic. Scholars ran clutching their precious books. Families abandoned their homes with doors still open. That night, Sunni Ali's soldiers set fires. Thousands of manuscripts burned. The ones that survived families hid them in secret libraries, in underground chambers, in the walls of their houses. Some of those hidden manuscripts stayed there for 500 years. Some are still being discovered today. But Sunni Ali wasn't finished. Over the next 7 years, he launched 5 separate purges of Timbuktu's scholars. Every time the intellectual class tried to rebuild, he came back and crushed them again. The scholars wrote that he was a monster, a tyrant, an illiterate brute who hated learning. But maybe that's not the whole story. Maybe Sunni Ali understood something the scholars didn't want to admit. That knowledge is power, and he wanted to make sure that power stayed in the hands of warriors, not academics. While he was burning books, Sunni Ali was building an army unlike anything West Africa had ever seen. He created a cavalry force of 10,000 men wearing iron armor. He bred horses specifically adapted to survive the brutal heat of the Sahara. He built a river navy of 400 war canoes and appointed a commander called the Master of the Water. And he used this military machine to conquer everything in his path. In 1473, Sunni Ali laid siege to the city of Jannah. The city was built on an island in the middle of a river, protected by water on all sides, impossible to attack directly. So Sunni Ali's engineers dug canals for miles, rechanneling the river to allow his boats to surround the city completely. The siege lasted 7 months. When Jannah finally surrendered, Sunni Ali had control of the 2 greatest cities in West Africa, Timbuktu and Jannah, plus his own capital of Gao. He now ruled an empire larger than Mali had ever been, larger than Ghana, the biggest empire in African history up to that point. Sunni Ali ruled for 28 years, and then in November 1492, he died. The official story says he drowned crossing a flooded river, but the timing was suspicious. His closest general, a man named Muhammad Touré, became king less than a year later. Did Muhammad Touré have Sunni Ali killed? We don't know for certain, but here's what we do know. Sunni Ali's soldiers buried him immediately before anyone could examine the body. They buried him in a secret location that has never been found. And Muhammad Touré, who took the title Askia Muhammad, spent the rest of his life making sure history remembered Sunni Ali as a tyrant and a villain. Winners write the history books, and Askia Muhammad was definitely a winner. In 1493, he defeated Sunni Ali's son in battle and seized the throne. Then he did something remarkable, something that would change the empire forever. He made peace with the scholars. Askia Muhammad was everything Sunni Ali was not. He was educated, literate, a devout Muslim. He respected learning and knowledge. He reopened the schools in Timbuktu. He invited the scholars back. He funded the libraries. And in return, the scholars gave him something priceless: legitimacy. See, Askia Muhammad wasn't from the royal family. He'd taken the throne by force. But the scholars declared that his rule was legal under Islamic law. They wrote that Sunni Ali had been a tyrant and that Muhammad was a liberator. They gave him the religious and intellectual backing he needed to hold the empire together. And once he had that legitimacy, Askia Muhammad did what great emperors do. He reformed everything. He reorganized the military, replacing slave soldiers with professional warriors. He divided the empire into provinces and appointed governors to rule them. He standardized taxes and measurements and trade regulations. He turned Songhai from a collection of conquered territories into an actual nation. In 1324, following the example of Mansa Musa 200 years earlier, Askia Muhammad made a pilgrimage to Mecca. But this wasn't just about religion. This was about politics. He invited representatives from every ethnic group in the empire to join him. Fulbe people, Tuareg people, Mandinka people, even groups that Sunni Ali had massacred. He brought them all together under one banner, one mission, one identity. He was building something more than an empire. He was building a nation, a unified people. And it worked. Under Askia Muhammad, the Songhai Empire reached its peak. The empire stretched 1,400 square kilometers from the Atlantic coast to the borders of modern Nigeria. It controlled all the major trade routes, all the gold, all the salt, all the wealth. At its height, the Songhai Empire was roughly the same size as the Roman Empire had been at its peak. Your ancestors built an empire as large as Rome, in the middle of the desert. With 50-degree heat and poison winds and no natural resources except river water and human ingenuity. They built that. Askia Muhammad ruled for 35 years. He had 37 sons, though some oral traditions claim he had 500. Whether that's true or exaggeration, the point is clear. He had a lot of heirs, a lot of potential successors, a lot of people who might want his throne. And that became a problem. In 1528, one of his sons, a man named Musa, decided he didn't want to wait for his father to die naturally. Askia Muhammad was old by then, going blind. Musa staged a coup, overthrew his father, and sent him into exile on a small island full of mosquitoes and toads. The greatest king in Songhai history spent 8 years in that miserable exile before another son rescued him and brought him home. He died in 1538, 10 years after losing his throne, but the damage was done. Musa's coup started a pattern. For the next 63 years, from 1528 to 1591, the empire tore itself apart with civil wars. Sons killed fathers, brothers killed brothers. Every few years, a new emperor, a new rebellion, a new war. The army grew weaker, the economy suffered, the empire was bleeding, and far to the north, across the Sahara Desert, someone was watching. Someone who saw the chaos and smelled opportunity. The Sultan of Morocco, Ahmad al-Mansur, had just defeated Portugal in 1578 at the Battle of the Three Kings. It was a great victory, but it emptied his treasury. He needed money desperately, and he knew exactly where to get it. The gold mines of Songhai, the salt mines of Tagaza, the legendary wealth of Gao and Timbuktu. All he had to do was take it. So in November 1590, Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur called for one of his generals, a Spanish slave, who had converted to Islam and risen through the ranks. His name was Judar Pasha, and the Sultan gave him a simple order. Cross the Sahara Desert, invade Songhai, take the gold, bring it home. Judar Pasha assembled an army of 4,000 men, 500 cavalry, 2,500 soldiers armed with muskets, 1,500 support troops, and 8 English cannons. This was a small force by any standard. Songhai had 10 times that many soldiers, but Judar had something Songhai didn't have: guns. In November 1590, this small army began marching south into the Sahara. They walked for 4 months through the burning sand and freezing nights. Men died of thirst. Men died of heat stroke. Camels collapsed. Supplies ran low. By the time they reached the edge of the Songhai Empire, in March 1591, they were exhausted, starving, and reduced to barely 3,000 effective fighters. But they still had their guns, and that was enough. The Songhai Emperor at that time was Askia Ishak Tseku. When scouts reported that a Moroccan army was approaching, Ishak gathered his forces, 40,000 infantry, possibly as many as 80,000 total, though sources vary, 10,000 cavalry in full armor, against 3,000 half-starved Moroccans. The Songhai commanders were confident. They had a plan. They rounded up 1,000 cattle, planned to stampede them directly into the Moroccan lines, to break their formation, then charge with cavalry and finish them. It should have worked. It would have worked against any traditional army. But this wasn't a traditional army. On March 12, 1591, the two forces met at a place called Tondibi, just north of Gao. The Songhai released the cattle, 1,000 terrified animals charging toward the Moroccan lines. Then the Moroccan cannons fired. The sound alone was like nothing the Songhai warriors had ever heard. Thunder from clear skies. The cattle panicked. They turned around and stampeded back into the Songhai formation, trampling hundreds of soldiers. Chaos erupted. Officers screamed orders that couldn't be heard over the bellowing animals and the screaming wounded. And then the Songhai cavalry charged. 10,000 horsemen in iron armor, the finest fighting force in West Africa, galloping at full speed toward 3,000 exhausted foreign soldiers. The muskets opened fire, not one shot, not 10. Volleys, coordinated firing lines, bowls of lead ripping through armor that had been designed to stop arrows and spears, not bullets traveling at supersonic speed. Horses crashed to the ground. Riders flew through the air. The charge broke apart before it even reached the Moroccan lines. The royal bodyguard, the emperor's personal troops, refused to run. They knelt in formation, shields locked, and prepared to fight to the death. The muskets cut them down, every single one. By sunset it was over. 40,000 Songhai soldiers routed by 3,000 Moroccans. Emperor Ishak II fled south with what remained of his army. Within weeks he was overthrown by his own generals for cowardice, and Judar Pasha marched into Gao unopposed. The Moroccan soldiers couldn't believe what they found. Warehouses full of gold, storehouses packed with salt, which was worth its weight in gold in some markets, manuscripts, art, treasure beyond imagination. They looted everything. They stripped the palace down to bare walls. They took 30 camels loaded with gold and sent them back to Morocco. Then they marched to Timbuktu and did the same thing there. The scholars of Timbuktu tried to hide their books like their ancestors had during Sunni Ali's purges. They stuffed manuscripts into walls, buried them in the desert, smuggled them out of the city in the dark of night. But the Moroccans found many of them. 300,000 manuscripts had been stored in Timbuktu's libraries. After the Moroccan invasion, maybe half survived, maybe less. Nobody knows exactly. The Moroccans took scholars as hostages, chained them up, and marched them back to Morocco to serve in the Sultan's court. They changed the tax laws to prevent people from rebuilding. They burned property records so nobody could prove what they'd owned. And then they left small garrisons behind to control the cities and extract wealth for the next 200 years. The Empire of Songhai, the largest empire in African history, the wealthiest kingdom in the world, was gone, erased, in less than 1 year. But the story doesn't end there, because what happened after 1591 is just as important as what happened before. The Moroccan occupation lasted until around 1780, almost 200 years of foreign control, economic exploitation, and cultural suppression. During that time, the cities of Gao, Timbuktu, and Jenne declined from thriving metropolises to struggling towns. The population of Timbuktu dropped by 80%. The artisan class, the craftsmen and builders and artists, declined by 60%. The trans-Saharan trade, which had made the region wealthy for 1,000 years, began shifting to coastal routes controlled by Europeans. The wealth that had flowed through Gao for centuries now flowed through ports on the Atlantic coast straight into European ships, and those ships were increasingly carrying a different kind of cargo: human beings. Because while the Songhai Empire was collapsing in 1591, something else was happening on the other side of the Atlantic. In 1492, the same year Sunni Ali died, Christopher Columbus reached the Americas. By 1500, Portuguese traders had established the first slave trading posts in West Africa. By 1520, the first enslaved Africans arrived in the Caribbean, and after Songhai fell in 1591, the floodgates opened. Without a strong central empire to resist them, European slavers raided West African villages at will. Between 1500 and 1860, 12 million enslaved Africans were shipped across the Atlantic. 12 million. 2 million died during the voyage, their bodies thrown overboard to feed the sharks. The survivors arrived in chains to build wealth for other people in lands they'd never heard of. And here's what you need to understand. This wasn't random. This wasn't just opportunistic raiders grabbing whoever they could find. The collapse of Songhai in 1591 directly enabled the expansion of the Atlantic slave trade. A strong unified empire could resist European encroachment. Hundreds of small weak kingdoms could not. They fell one by one. So let's connect the dots. In 1000 AD, your ancestors controlled the gold that ran the world economy. For 500 years, Ghana, then Mali, then Songhai dominated global trade. They built cities, libraries, armies, universities. They accumulated wealth that would make modern billionaires look poor. Then in 1591, guns destroyed that empire. Foreign powers looted the cities, burned the books, and extracted the wealth. What they couldn't carry, they destroyed. Why? Because as long as Africans controlled their own resources, as long as they had power and knowledge and unity, they couldn't be enslaved en masse. But once that power was broken, once the empire fell and the wealth was taken and the knowledge was burned, then the slave trade could expand without resistance. The destruction of Songhai wasn't just a military defeat. It was the beginning of 400 years of theft, exploitation, and erasure. And that brings us to the pattern. Because this didn't just happen to Songhai, it happened to Ghana before them. Internal conflict weakened Ghana, then Mali conquered them and took their wealth. It happened to Mali. Internal conflict weakened Mali, then Songhai took their place. It happened to Songhai. Internal conflict weakened Songhai, then Morocco destroyed them. Every single time the same pattern. Black people build wealth. Black people build power. Then internal division weakens them. Then external enemies destroy them and steal everything. Do you see it now? This wasn't accident. This wasn't bad luck. This was the pattern that kept repeating because it worked. But here's what makes it even worse. After they destroyed these empires, they erased them from history. They removed them from textbooks. They changed the narrative. And that's what we need to talk about next, because the suppression of this history is just as important as the history itself. When Heinrich Barth, that German explorer, reached the ruins of Gao in 1858, he found 300 huts scattered among overgrown rubble. 300 families living in the wreckage of what had once been the capital of the world's wealthiest empire. He wrote in his journal that the massive tower of the principal mosque still stood crumbling but defiant, surrounded by date palms and tamarind trees and silk cotton plants that had grown wild over the ruins. He estimated that at its peak, the city had a circumference of 6 miles. 6 miles of walls and buildings and markets and palaces. Now it was nothing but stones and memories, and a handful of people too stubborn to leave. But Barth was curious. He asked questions. He took notes. He measured the ruins. He interviewed the locals about what had happened here. And when he returned to Europe and published his findings, do you know what happened? Nothing. Nobody cared. European scholars dismissed his claims. They said he was exaggerating. They said Africans couldn't possibly have built cities that large or empires that wealthy. They said he'd been fooled by local legends and tall tales. Never mind that Barth spoke Arabic and several African languages fluently. Never mind that he'd traveled 20,000 kilometers across West Africa and documented everything meticulously. Never mind that he was a trained scholar who knew the difference between myth and reality. They simply refused to believe that black Africans had built something great. Because if they admitted that if they acknowledged that truth, then they'd have to admit that colonization wasn't bringing civilization to savages. They'd have to admit they were destroying a civilization that had existed for centuries before Europeans even knew it was there. So they buried the evidence. Not physically, though they did plenty of that too. They buried it academically. They removed African empires from the historical record. They wrote textbooks that started African history with the arrival of Europeans, as if nothing had happened before that. As if the continent had just been sitting there empty and primitive, waiting for white people to show up and give it meaning. They taught generations of children, black and white alike, that Africa had no history worth knowing, no achievements worth celebrating, no empires, no cities, no scholars, no art, no culture, just tribes and huts and primitive customs. And here's the thing. That lie became the foundation of everything that came after. You can't enslave people if you see them as equals. You can't colonize their land if you believe they have legitimate governments and property rights. You can't steal their resources if you acknowledge that those resources belonged to someone. So they had to erase the history first. They had to create the lie of African inferiority before they could justify the theft. Let me give you some specific examples of how they did this. In 1893, the Chicago World's Fair featured exhibits from around the globe, showcasing human achievement and progress. There was a palace of fine arts displaying European paintings and sculpture. There was a transportation building showing the latest trains and automobiles. There was electricity, which was still new and amazing to most people. And there was an exhibit called the Midway Plaisance, a mile-long stretch where fair organizers had arranged exhibits of people from different cultures in order of what they considered evolutionary development. At one end, closest to the white city of grand buildings and modern marvels, they placed exhibits of white Europeans and Americans. At the far end, the primitive end, they placed exhibits of Africans, Native Americans, and other non-white peoples. They literally arranged human beings in a hierarchy to demonstrate that white people were the most evolved and civilized. But here's what makes this relevant to our story. There was no mention of Songhai at that fair, no mention of Timbuktu's libraries, no mention of Mansa Musa, or the trans-Saharan gold trade, or the architectural wonders of Gao and Djenné. Instead, they showed Africans in fake villages performing what they called primitive customs for white audiences who paid to gawk at them. They presented Africa as a continent without history, without achievement, without civilization. And millions of people, including children on school field trips, absorbed that message. This happened in 1893. Not the Middle Ages, not ancient history, your great-grandparents' generation. They did this deliberately, while people who remembered the truth were still alive. The same thing happened in education. When European colonial powers divided up Africa at the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, One of their first acts in every colonized territory was to take control of schools. They replaced traditional education systems with European-style schools that taught European history, European languages, European values. They banned the teaching of pre-colonial African history. In some places, they made it illegal to speak indigenous languages in school. Children were punished for speaking their own languages, for practicing their own customs, for remembering their own stories. Within one generation, they'd created a population that had been cut off from its own past. People who didn't know what their grandparents had known. People who'd been taught to be ashamed of their own heritage. And this wasn't just in Africa. This happened in America too. After slavery ended in 1865, during the brief period of Reconstruction, when Black Americans gained political power and started building wealth again, white supremacists launched a campaign to control education. They wrote textbooks that portrayed slavery as a benign institution where happy slaves loved their masters. They taught that the Civil War was about states' rights, not slavery. They removed any mention of black achievement or resistance or power. The Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, where white mobs destroyed the wealthiest black neighborhood in America, wasn't taught in Oklahoma schools for 75 years. 3 generations of Oklahoma children, black and white, grew up not knowing that in their own state, 35 blocks of black prosperity had been burned to the ground and 300 people murdered. The textbooks just didn't mention it, like it never happened. The same thing happened with Black Wall Street in Durham, North Carolina, with Rosewood, Florida, where a thriving black town was completely destroyed in 1923, and survivors were hunted through the swamps. With the Wilmington Massacre of 1898, where white supremacists overthrew a democratically elected multiracial government, killed dozens of black citizens, and drove thousands more out of the city. With the Elaine Massacre in Arkansas in 1919, where white mobs killed over 200 black sharecroppers who'd tried to organize for fair wages. None of this was taught in schools. None of it appeared in textbooks. They removed it all deliberately and systematically, so that each new generation would grow up not knowing what had been taken from them. Now think about what that does psychologically. If you don't know your ancestors built empires, you can't draw strength from that knowledge. If you don't know your ancestors controlled global trade, you can't imagine yourself doing the same. If you don't know your ancestors were scholars and kings and warriors and architects, you can't see yourself as anything but what they tell you you are. The erasure of history isn't just about the past. It's about controlling the present and the future. It's about making sure you never know what you're capable of. Because if you knew, if you really understood what your ancestors achieved, you'd demand the same for yourself. You'd ask dangerous questions like, if my ancestors were that powerful and that wealthy, why am I poor now? Where did all that wealth go? Who took it? And what are they going to do to give it back? But they didn't just erase the history from books, they destroyed it physically too. Remember those 300,000 manuscripts in Timbuktu? The ones that survived Sunni Ali's purges and the Moroccan invasion. Many of them survived for another 400 years, hidden in private family libraries, passed down from generation to generation. Families who understood that these books were precious, that they contained knowledge that couldn't be allowed to disappear. In 2012, Islamic extremists occupied Timbuktu and began destroying the manuscripts again. They burned them in the streets. They used them as fuel for cooking fires. They ripped them apart. They called them un-Islamic because they contained pre-Islamic African knowledge, astronomical charts, mathematical treatises, poetry, history. Thousands more manuscripts were destroyed. The families who'd protected these books for centuries watched their heritage burn for the second time in history. And when that happened, how much coverage did it get in American media? How many news reports did you see about the burning of one of the world's greatest libraries? Compare that to how much coverage the burning of Notre Dame Cathedral got in 2019. Notre Dame is a beautiful building, and its burning was tragic, absolutely. But it's a building. It can be rebuilt. Those manuscripts from Timbuktu were irreplaceable. Once burned, that knowledge is gone forever. But one story dominated the news for weeks, while the other barely got mentioned. That tells you something about whose history we're supposed to care about, whose achievements we're supposed to value, whose losses we're supposed to mourn. The physical destruction went beyond books. They destroyed the economic infrastructure too. After the Moroccan invasion, they deliberately changed the trade routes. Instead of going through Gao and Timbuktu, trade shifted to coastal ports controlled by Europeans. The cities that had been economic powerhouses for 500 years were cut out of the network. Merchants stopped coming, markets closed, artisans lost their customers, the economy collapsed. But this wasn't natural market forces. This was deliberate economic warfare. They destroyed the cities, then they destroyed the trade routes. Then they prevented anyone from rebuilding. They did the same thing with the salt mines at Tagaza, the incredibly valuable mines that had been one of the reasons Morocco invaded in the first place. Salt was worth its weight in gold in many markets because it was the only way to preserve food in a hot climate. Control the salt. Control the food supply. Control the people. After the invasion, Morocco controlled Tagaza. When European colonial powers took over later, they controlled it. The local people who'd worked those mines for generations, who'd built wealth from that resource, were reduced to wage laborers working for foreign companies. The wealth that had stayed in Africa for 1,000 years now flowed out to Europe, and it never came back. Now let's talk about how they manipulated the language and the narrative, because this is subtle but incredibly effective. They changed what things were called. The Battle of Tondibi, where Songhai fell, that's called a battle in the history books, when it's mentioned at all. But the destruction of Timbuktu afterward, the looting and burning and killing, that's not called a massacre. It's not called a war crime. It's just described as the Moroccan occupation, like it was a peaceful administrative transition. Compare that to how they describe European conflicts. When Napoleon's army looted art from Italy and Egypt, historians call it cultural theft. When the Nazis stole art during World War II, we hunted down every piece and returned it to the rightful owners. We're still doing that today. But when Morocco and later European powers looted West Africa, when they took gold and salt and manuscripts and sacred objects and human beings, we don't call that theft in the history books. We call it trade. We call it exploration. We call it the colonial period, like it was just a chapter in history that happened naturally, not a deliberate campaign of extraction and exploitation. They changed the words we use to describe African political systems too. European kingdoms are called empires. African empires are called kingdoms, which sounds smaller and less sophisticated. European rulers are called emperors and kings. African rulers are called chiefs and tribal leaders, which makes them sound primitive. European armies are armies. African armies are often called warrior bands or tribal militias, like they were just mobs of people with spears instead of organized military forces with command structures and strategies and training. The language shapes how we think about history, and they've shaped that language very carefully to diminish African achievement. In movies and television, how is Africa portrayed? When you see Africa in a Hollywood film, what do you see? Jungles, right? Wild animals. Safari adventures. Tribes wearing loincloths and carrying spears. Tarzan swinging through trees. The Lion King, which is a great movie, but still perpetuates the idea that Africa is about animals, not people, not civilizations. When's the last time you saw a movie about Mansa Musa, about Askia Muhammad, about the scholars of Timbuktu or the cavalry of Songhai Empire? You've never seen that movie because they won't make it. They'll make movies about ancient Rome and ancient Greece and medieval Europe and imperial China and feudal Japan, but not about African empires. Why? Because if they made those movies, if they showed black kings and black scholars and black warriors building empires and controlling global trade and creating art and architecture that rivaled anything in Europe, people would ask questions. People would say, wait, if Africa was that advanced, that powerful, that wealthy, then what happened? Where did it all go? Who took it? And how do we get it back? So instead they make the word Timbuktu itself a joke, a metaphor for somewhere far away and irrelevant. People say, oh, that's out in Timbuktu, meaning the middle of nowhere. But Timbuktu wasn't the middle of nowhere. It was the center of everything. It was the intellectual capital of Africa, the Harvard and Oxford of its time. Changing the meaning of that word, making it a punchline, that's erasure. That's making sure nobody takes it seriously when you mention African achievement. In 2006, a British survey found that 30% of respondents thought Timbuktu was a mythical place like Atlantis. They didn't believe it really existed. That's how successful the erasure campaign has been. An actual city with an actual history of actual achievement has been turned into a myth that a third of people don't even believe is real. And it's not just cultural. They encoded the erasure into law. After European powers colonized West Africa, they created property laws that essentially legalized theft. They declared that all land belonged to the colonial government, unless you could produce European-style written deeds proving ownership. But African property systems didn't work that way. Land was held communally or passed down through oral tradition and custom. So when people couldn't produce written deeds, the colonial governments declared the land vacant and gave it to European settlers or companies. Millions of acres of land that had belonged to African families for generations were legally stolen through this system. And when independence came in the 1960s, most of those property arrangements weren't reversed. The land stayed in the hands of whoever had claimed it during colonial rule. The same thing happened with resources. Mining rights were sold to European companies during the colonial period. When independence came, those contracts were still enforced. So today, in the very regions where Songhai once controlled the gold trade, where African empires accumulated wealth for 1,000 years, international corporations extract the gold, and the profits flow to shareholders in London and Paris and New York. The people who actually live there, the descendants of the people who built that wealth, get jobs in the mines if they're lucky. Low-wage jobs, dangerous jobs. Jobs where they dig up their own heritage and ship it away to enrich someone else. That's not ancient history. That's happening right now today in 2025. Now let's bring this home. Let's connect the dots between 1591 and your life right now in 2025. Because this isn't just about what happened to your ancestors. This is about what's happening to you. The median white household in America has $188,000 in wealth. The median black household has $24,000. That's a ratio of nearly 8 to 1. 8 times more wealth in white households than black households. And people will tell you that's because of differences in education or work ethic or family structure. They'll give you a dozen explanations that all boil down to blaming black people for being poor. But that's not what the numbers show. That's not what history shows. Let me walk you through this. From the year 1000 to 1591, your ancestors controlled the majority of the world's gold supply. They built cities, accumulated wealth, established trade networks that spanned continents. If that wealth had been allowed to compound over generations, the way European wealth was allowed to compound, where would it be now? If the families of Gao and Timbuktu had been able to pass their wealth down to their children and their children's children and so on, for 400 years, with normal investment and growth, those families would be worth billions today. Each family, not collectively, individually. They would be the Rockefellers and Rothschilds and Vanderbilts of Africa. But that didn't happen, because in 1591 foreign invaders destroyed the empire, looted the cities, and took the wealth. Then, for the next 300 years, they extracted more wealth through colonization. Then they enslaved 12 million people and shipped them to other continents to build wealth for other people. Then, after slavery ended, they used legal systems and violence to prevent Black Americans from accumulating wealth again. Every time Black people built something, they destroyed it. Every single time. Black Wall Street in Tulsa, 18,000 residents, 600 businesses, 21 churches, 21 restaurants, 30 grocery stores, 2 movie theaters, a hospital, a bank, a post office, libraries, schools, law offices, a half-dozen private airplanes owned by Black residents, the wealthiest Black community in America. Destroyed in 1921 by white mobs who burned it to the ground, killed 300 people, and faced no consequences. The survivors got nothing, no reparations, no rebuilding funds. Insurance companies refused to pay claims. The city changed fire codes to make rebuilding more expensive. Within a generation, that wealth was gone, erased. Just like Gao, just like Timbuktu, Rosewood, Florida, a prosperous Black town in 1923. Within a week, it didn't exist anymore. White mobs burned every building, killed dozens of residents, and hunted survivors through the swamps. The town was never rebuilt. The land was never returned. The wealth disappeared. Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898. Black and white citizens had elected a multiracial government. The city was thriving. White supremacists couldn't tolerate that, so they staged a coup. The only successful coup in American history. They murdered Black citizens, burned Black businesses, overthrew the government, and installed white supremacists in power. Thousands of Black residents fled and never came back. Their property was seized, their businesses taken over, their wealth stolen. Elaine, Arkansas, 1919. Black sharecroppers tried to organize a union to demand fair wages. White mobs killed over 200 of them, burned their homes, took their land. No prosecutions, no justice, no reparations. Do you see the pattern now? It's the same pattern as Ghana, Mali, Songhai. Black people build wealth. External forces destroy it and take it. This isn't ancient history. This is a continuous pattern from 1591 to 2025. 434 years of systematic theft. And then they have the audacity to ask why there's a wealth gap. They stole $100 trillion worth of labor during slavery. That's not an exaggeration. Economists have calculated it. $100 trillion in today's money. They stole the land. They stole the businesses. They stole the generational wealth that would have compounded over centuries. And now they say the wealth gap is because Black people don't work hard enough or don't make good financial decisions. That's not just wrong. That's obscene. It's like robbing someone's house and then criticizing them for being homeless. And it's still happening. Gentrification is the modern version of the Tulsa massacre. It's slower and uses legal mechanisms instead of torches, but the result is the same. Black neighborhoods that have been communities for generations suddenly get redeveloped. Property taxes skyrocket. Long-time residents can't afford to pay. They're forced to sell. Developers, almost always white or white-owned corporations, buy the properties cheap. They tear down affordable housing and build luxury condos. They bring in expensive stores that the original residents can't afford to shop in. Within a decade, the neighborhood has completely changed. The black families who built that community are gone, pushed out to cheaper areas farther from jobs and good schools. And the wealth that should have been theirs, the rising property values, the business opportunities, all of that goes to someone else. It's extraction, it's theft. It's GAO 1591 happening in slow motion in Atlanta and Oakland and Harlem and Durham in 2025. Mass incarceration is the modern version of slavery. The 13th Amendment, the one that supposedly ended slavery, has an exception. It says slavery is illegal except as punishment for crime. Except as punishment for crime. That loophole has been exploited for 150 years to re-enslave black people under a different name. After slavery ended, southern states passed laws called black codes that made it illegal for black people to be unemployed, or to walk down the street without a white person vouching for them, or to gather in groups. The punishments were prison. And in prison, they were leased out to plantations and mines and factories to do forced labor. It was slavery with a different name. Today we have drug laws that are enforced selectively, school-to-prison pipelines that criminalize black children, and a prison system that incarcerates 2.3 million people, disproportionately black, and forces them to work for pennies per hour. The products they make are sold for profit. The prison industrial complex generates billions of dollars. That's slave labor. That's extraction of black labor for white profit. Same pattern, different era. Police brutality is the modern version of the enforcers who kept slaves in line and terrorized black communities during Jim Crow. The same mentality, the same violence, the same impunity. When Moroccan soldiers killed Songhai warriors at Tondibi in 1591, they faced no consequences. They were following orders, doing their job. When white mobs killed black residents in Tulsa in 1921, they faced no consequences. When police officers kill unarmed black people in 2025, they overwhelmingly face no consequences. Paid leave, administrative duty, maybe a trial that ends in acquittal. The pattern never changes. Violence is used to control black populations, to prevent black prosperity, to maintain the hierarchy. And it works because there are never consequences for the people doing the violence. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Morocco used guns to destroy Songhai in 1591. Police use guns to terrorize black neighborhoods in 2025. 434 years between those events, but the same power dynamic, the same tool, the same message. We can destroy you whenever we want, and you can't stop us. But here's the thing. Here's what they don't want you to know. That message is a lie. Your ancestors didn't just survive. They built. Even after slavery, even after Jim Crow, even after Tulsa and Rosewood and Wilmington and Elaine and 1,000 other atrocities, they built. They kept building. Because that's who you are. That's what's in your DNA. You come from people who built empires in the desert, who controlled global trade for 1,000 years, who created universities and wrote books and trained scholars, who faced the poison winds and the burning sand and the endless enemies and kept building anyway. You are not victims. You need to understand this. You are not the descendants of victims. You are the descendants of warriors, of kings, of scholars, of builders, of survivors. Your ancestors survived the Middle Passage, where 2 million people died in the holds of slave ships and were thrown overboard to feed sharks. They survived that. They survived 250 years of slavery, of brutality and rape, and family separation and dehumanization. They survived that. They survived Jim Crow, where they were lynched for looking at white people wrong, where they couldn't vote or own property or get education or defend themselves. They survived that. They survived Tulsa and Rosewood and Wilmington and Elaine and redlining and urban renewal and mass incarceration and police brutality. They survived all of it. And that strength, that resilience, that refusal to be broken, that's in you. That's your inheritance. They stole your wealth, but they couldn't steal your bloodline. They erased your history, but they couldn't erase your DNA. You carry the genes of people who built the largest empire in African history. You carry the legacy of Sunni Ali, who conquered everything in his path with iron cavalry and war canoes. You carry the legacy of Askia Muhammad, who united 24 ethnic groups into one nation. You carry the legacy of the scholars of Timbuktu, who preserved 300,000 manuscripts through 500 years of invasion and occupation and burning. You carry the legacy of the gold miners who made West Africa the wealthiest region in the world. That's who you are. Not what they told you you are. Not the stereotype. Not the lie. You are royalty. You are excellence. You are power. And here's why your poverty isn't your fault. It's not because you're lazy. It's not because you make bad choices. It's not because you don't value education or family. It's because they stole your inheritance. If Gao hadn't been burned in 1591, if Timbuktu hadn't been looted, if the gold trade hadn't been redirected, if slavery hadn't happened, if Tulsa hadn't been destroyed, if redlining hadn't prevented your grandparents from buying homes, if mass incarceration hadn't locked up your father or uncle or brother, if gentrification wasn't pushing you out of your neighborhood right now, where would you be? Where would your family be? You would have the accumulated wealth of generations. You would have property. You would have businesses. You would have education. You would have networks. You would have power. But they took it, systematically, deliberately, for 400 years. And then they told you it was your fault you didn't have it. That's why reparations isn't a handout. It's not charity. It's not asking for something you didn't earn. It's demanding return of stolen property. When Morocco looted Gao in 1591, they sent 30 camels loaded with gold back to their sultan. That gold was stolen. In today's money, that's billions of dollars. Morocco owes that back. When European colonial powers extracted resources from West Africa for 300 years, they stole trillions in value. They owe that back. When America enslaved 12 million Africans and extracted $100 trillion in labor, they stole that. America owes that back. When white mobs destroyed Black Wall Street and Rosewood and dozens of other thriving black communities, they stole the property and the wealth and the future earnings. They owe that back. This isn't about revenge. This isn't about making white people feel guilty. This is about accounting. This is about looking at the ledger and seeing that one side has been stealing from the other side for 400 years, and the books need to balance. Reparations isn't a radical idea. It's basic justice. Germany paid reparations to Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. America paid reparations to Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II. South Africa had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to address apartheid. Every society that commits atrocities eventually has to face them and make amends, except when the victims are black. Then suddenly it's too long ago, too complicated, too expensive, too divisive. But it wasn't too long ago. Songhai fell in 1591, just 434 years. People alive today had grandparents who were born into slavery, had parents who lived through Jim Crow, experienced redlining personally. This isn't ancient history. The theft is ongoing, and the debt is due. So what do you do with this knowledge? What do you do now that you know your ancestors were kings and scholars and warriors? Now that you know your poverty isn't your fault, but the result of systematic theft, now that you know the same patterns that destroyed Gao are still operating in your neighborhood today, you reclaim your identity. You stop accepting their definition of who you are. You stop internalizing their lies about your worth and your capabilities. You are not what they say you are. You are what your ancestors were. Powerful, brilliant, wealthy, unconquerable. You come from people who built empires, and that means you can build too. Not waiting for permission, not asking for approval. Build, create wealth, start businesses, buy property, invest, educate yourself and your children, build networks, build communities, build power. But don't do it alone, and don't do it quietly. Demand reparations, demand return of stolen land, demand equal investment in black neighborhoods, demand an end to mass incarceration, demand police accountability, demand that history books tell the truth about Songhai and Ghana and Mali and Timbuktu and Tulsa and Rosewood and all the rest. Demand that your children learn about their real heritage, not the sanitized, whitewashed version designed to keep them docile. Make noise. Make them uncomfortable. Make them face what they did and what they owe. Because they're not going to give it back willingly. They never do. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. And understand this. God preserved you for a reason. Think about it. Your ancestors survived the Middle Passage when 2 million others died. Why your ancestors survived slavery when millions died in the fields. Why your ancestors survived Jim Crow when thousands were lynched. Why your ancestors survived Tulsa and Rosewood and Wilmington and Elaine. Why? Because God had a purpose for you. Because you're here now in 2025, at this moment in history, when the lies are crumbling and the truth is coming out and people are waking up. You finding this video today isn't an accident. It's divine appointment. God wants you to know who you really are, where you really come from, what you're really capable of, because you have a mission. Your mission is to be the light in darkness, to speak truth when everyone else is silent, to remember when everyone else forgets, to demand justice when everyone else accepts injustice, to rebuild what was destroyed, to reclaim what was stolen, to restore what was lost. You are the answer to your ancestors' prayers. They survived hell so you could be here, so you could learn the truth, so you could take back what's yours, so you could build the empire again. Not the same way, not in the same place, but with the same spirit, the same strength, the same refusal to be broken. You are the heir to Gao, the heir to Timbuktu, the heir to the gold of the Sahara, and it's time to claim your inheritance. If this truth shook you, if it changed how you see yourself and your history and your future, I need you to do something right now. Comment the word truth below. Let me know this reached you. Hit that like button if you're tired of the lies, if you're ready to learn who you really are. And share this video. Share it with your family, your friends, your church. Anyone who needs to know that their ancestors were kings, not just slaves. That their heritage is empire, not just oppression. That their future is power, not just survival. Don't let them erase us again. Every share is an act of resistance. Every view is a person waking up. Every comment is a voice saying we know the truth now and we're not going back to sleep. Subscribe to this channel because this is just one story. There are hundreds more, thousands more. The 7 black kings assassinated by the CIA because they refused to let foreign corporations steal their country's resources. The 5 African queens who led armies against European colonizers and won battles that they erased from history. The kingdom of Aksum in ancient Ethiopia that was wealthier than Egypt and traded with Rome and China. The Moors who ruled Spain for 700 years and brought mathematics and science and architecture that Europeans claimed as their own. The story of how the Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave revolt in history, terrified America so much that they punished Haiti for 200 years and are still punishing them today. Story after story after story of black excellence, black power, black achievement that they buried because they didn't want you to know what you're capable of. We're bringing it all back. We're excavating the truth. We're restoring the memory. And you're part of that. You watching this video, you learning this truth, you sharing it with others, that's how we win. That's how we take back what they stole. Not just the money, though we're owed that. Not just the land, though we're owed that too. But the knowledge, the pride, the identity, the understanding of who we really are. They can't stop us if we know who we are. They can't break us if we remember where we come from. They can't erase us if we refuse to be silent. So speak up, stand up, wake up, and don't you dare go back to sleep. Tell your children this story. Tell them about Gao and Timbuktu and Sunni Ali and Askia Muhammad and the gold that made Europe wealthy and the knowledge that filled 300,000 manuscripts and the empire that spanned 1,400 square kilometers. Tell them so they know, so they walk differently, so they talk differently, so they dream differently. Because when black children know they descend from kings, they act like royalty. When they know their ancestors built empires, they build too. When they know the wealth gap isn't their fault, but the result of theft, they demand what's owed. That's what they're afraid of. That's why they erased the history. So tell it. Shout it. Make sure the next generation knows what this generation didn't know. That's how we break the cycle. That's how we win. Father God, we come before you with grateful hearts. We thank you for preserving this truth through 400 years of erasure and lies and destruction. We thank you for the warriors who came before us, for Sunni Ali, who built an empire from nothing, for Askia Muhammad, who united dozens of peoples into one nation, for the scholars of Timbuktu, who risked their lives to hide manuscripts so that knowledge wouldn't be lost forever, for the families who kept those books safe for generations, passing them down as sacred trust, for the survivors of Tondibi, who refused to surrender even when the battle was lost, for the slaves who survived the Middle Passage, for the ancestors who endured plantation brutality, for the grandparents who lived through Jim Crow, for the parents who survived redlining and urban renewal and mass incarceration. We thank you for every single one of them who suffered and survived so that we could be here today. We pray for justice, Lord. Justice for the people of Gao, whose city was burned and wealth was stolen. Justice for the scholars of Timbuktu, whose books were destroyed. Justice for the 12 million enslaved Africans whose labor built wealth they never saw. Justice for the residents of Tulsa and Rosewood and Wilmington and Elaine, whose communities were destroyed and whose losses were never repaid. Justice for every black person who has been denied opportunity, denied dignity, denied what is rightfully theirs. We don't pray for revenge, Lord. We pray for righteousness. We pray for truth to be acknowledged, for theft to be returned, for wrongs to be righted, for the books to balance. We pray for awakening. Wake up your people, Lord. Open their eyes to see who they really are. Break the chains of lies and shame and self-hatred that have kept them bound. Show them their true heritage. Let them see themselves as you see them, as royalty, as excellence, as power, as the descendants of empire builders and world changers. Give them the courage to demand what is theirs, the strength to build in hostile territory, the wisdom to teach their children truth, the perseverance to keep going when the obstacles seem impossible. Bless those who seek truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Strengthen those who resist erasure and fight for memory. Vindicate the names and legacies of our ancestors who were slandered and forgotten. Give us courage to demand reparations, to claim our inheritance, to rebuild what was destroyed. Protect us as we speak truth to power. Go before us as we reclaim what was stolen. And let the whole world see that you are a God of justice, a God who remembers, a God who restores. In the mighty name of Jesus Christ, who came to set the captives free and to proclaim good news to the poor and liberty to those who are oppressed, we pray. Amen. Walk in truth. Demand justice. Remember Gao. Remember Timbuktu. Remember the gold of the Sahara. Remember that you are not the descendant of slaves, but the descendant of kings. You are not poor because you're lazy, but because you were robbed. You are not powerless because you're inferior, but because power was stolen from you. And now you know. And knowledge is power, and that power cannot be taken away. Until next time, build wealth, demand reparations, and remember the theft. They tried to erase us. They failed. We're still here. We know who we are, and we're coming for what's ours.